December 19th, 2019. The Rise of Skywalker. Finn is sinking into a quicksand pit on an alien moon, and he's screaming Rey's name. The camera holds on him long enough to signal that something Force-related is happening, some connection through the ether that a non-Force-sensitive character simply couldn't have. He climbs out. For the rest of the film, across 4 separate scenes, he tries to tell Rey whatever he felt in that pit. 4 attempts, 4 interruptions, a comedy bit built around the repeated failure to deliver the revelation. The trilogy ends. The thing Finn wanted to say is never said on screen. J.J. Abrams answered the question in post-release press. Finn was going to tell Rey he was Force-sensitive. The production had apparently even weighed a love confession before deciding that the Force sensitivity reveal was the more interesting choice. So it wasn't ambiguity. The creative decision was made. Then the lines were filmed. John Boyega performed them. Boyega disclosed this at a fan convention in 2024. Deleted footage exists from Rise of Skywalker, where he delivered the line, "I'm a Jedi," apparently from the quicksand sequence itself. The cameras rolled. He said the words. The footage was cut before the film reached theaters. What landed in the finished film was a 3-movie arc that began with a deprogrammed stormtrooper picking up the Skywalker lightsaber and ended with that same character being interrupted 4 times before he could tell the protagonist he was Force-sensitive. 7+ hours of screen time, building towards something the trilogy never delivered. The proof that it was supposed to deliver it exists in Abrams' press tour, in Boyega's convention circuit disclosures, and in footage sitting in a vault at Lucasfilm. A deprogrammed child soldier who snaps, earns a name, learns the Force, and has to stand in front of the system that made him and reckon with what that system did to him. That story was right there. So who killed it? December 18th, 2015. The Force Awakens opens on Jakku with a massacre. First Order stormtroopers execute villagers under the command of Kylo Ren. One trooper, designation FN-2187, stops firing. His blaster drops to his side. The soldiers around him complete the job. Blood from a dying comrade smears across his visor, and the camera holds on it. Not action, not spectacle, but moral weight. That helmet, that smear, that silence in the middle of a massacre. The entire sequel trilogy could have been built on what that moment implies. Here is a human being inside an institution designed to eliminate individual humanity, and the institution is failing specifically in him. By the film's final act, FN-2187, now Finn, named by Poe Dameron because the First Order's designation system doesn't have room for people, has picked up the Skywalker lightsaber in a snow forest on Starkiller Base and entered single combat with Kylo Ren. The math on that fight should be ludicrous. Kylo Ren, trained under Luke Skywalker, was apprenticed to the supreme leader of the First Order and had spent the preceding decade developing Force mastery. Finn has had the lightsaber in his hand for approximately 24 hours. He doesn't win the duel, but he makes contact. He lands a blow that draws blood from Kylo's shoulder before being thrown into a tree and incapacitated. Against a trained Force user with years of practice, an untrained stormtrooper stayed on his feet and drew blood. The film presents this as heroism and grit. Its own companion material suggests it might be something else. The Force Awakens Visual Dictionary, published to coincide with the film's opening day, noted that Finn's arrival on Jakku coincided with a turbulence in the cosmic force, a sudden ripple indicating the awakening. Lucasfilm's officially licensed companion material used Force and Awakening in the same sentence to describe the moment Finn arrived on screen. This wasn't a fan reading between the lines. It was in print in an official document on December 18th, 2015. John Boyega read the first Force Awakens script and arrived at the same conclusion any actor reasoning from the evidence would reach. Speaking at a fan convention in 2024, he said he assumed from that script that Finn was Force-sensitive and that Lucasfilm was building toward a dual Jedi's dynamic with Rey. He went further. I actually thought that they would Obi-Wan and Darth Vader us a bit. that we would turn against each other or something along those lines. He was describing an arc where Finn, the escaped stormtrooper, trained in the First Order's disciplines, and Kylo Ren, the heir to Vader's armor and none of Vader's eventual redemption, would eventually face each other as the emotional center of the trilogy's conclusion. Two men shaped by the same ideology, one who rejected it and one who chose it, finally reckoning with what that choice cost each of them. That arc required nothing new. Every structural element was already in the first film. Finn's institutional knowledge of the First Order, from the inside, from a lifetime of conditioning, from personal experience of what the system does to the children it takes. His personal history with Kylo Ren, established in the Snow Forest duel. His demonstrated connection to a Force-sensitive weapon. His specific guilt. What had the conditioning made him capable of before the moment on Jakku when he stopped firing? The franchise had never given a main character that backstory. Not Luke, not Anakin, not Han. A protagonist who had to reckon with having been an instrument of atrocity, who had to build a moral identity out of the wreckage of one an institution had destroyed. Played through a Force awakening. Played against Kylo Ren as the mirror image. That was a story about what authoritarianism does to the people inside it, and what reclaiming humanity from institutional conditioning actually costs. Star Wars had been telling variations on this story since 1977. Finn's version was the most grounded, the most specifically human iteration the franchise had ever set up. The cultural weight compounded the narrative weight. A black Jedi at the center of a Star Wars trilogy, not as a supporting figure, but as a co-protagonist, whose arc would structurally parallel and counterpoint the villains, would have been new territory for the franchise at this scale. The marketing had already built that promise explicitly. The first teaser trailer opened with Boyega's face. The pre-release campaign positioned Finn as the face of what the sequel trilogy was supposed to be. He was reasonable to assume that the institution behind that marketing was building toward the story the marketing implied. The Last Jedi arrived December 15, 2017, directed by Rian Johnson. Finn's arc in the previous film had ended with him in a medical bay, recovering from a lightsaber wound across his spine. The second film in a trilogy is where the setup of film 1 begins to pay off, where the skills hinted at in the first act start becoming real. Johnson had Finn, and newly introduced Rose Tico, dispatched to the casino city of Canto Bight on Cantonica, in search of a codebreaker who could disable a tracking device aboard a First Order ship. To understand how completely this sidelined Finn, you need the parallel running simultaneously. While Finn was infiltrating a horse racing track and getting arrested by local police for parking violations. Literally, that is the inciting incident of the Canto Bight sequence. Rey was on Ahch-To, training with Luke Skywalker and developing a Force bond with Kylo Ren that would redefine both their characters through the remainder of the trilogy. Poe Dameron was running an internal mutiny against Vice Admiral Holdo aboard the Resistance flagship. The main narrative, the one with Force development, the one with the central villain, the one driving the trilogy forward, was happening entirely without Finn. He was adjacent to it, in a different solar system, looking for a man at a blackjack table. The mission failed. The codebreaker they found, DJ, sold the Resistance to the First Order for money. Finn and Rose were captured, nearly executed, escaped, and returned to the main storyline with nothing materially changed. The Force sensitivity that TFA's visual dictionary had flagged in Lucasfilm's own licensed companion material received zero development across The Last Jedi's 2 hours and 32 minutes. Finn's stormtrooper past, the most specific origin story in the trilogy, the detail that made him genuinely unlike any Star Wars protagonist before him, was used to motivate a speech about the war economy at a casino. Not a Force awakening, not a confrontation with the system that made him, a speech at a horse race. Boyega has been specific and documented about where the sidelining became structural. He named The Last Jedi directly across multiple interviews and convention appearances beginning in 2019, and he didn't equivocate. J.J. Abrams returned for The Rise of Skywalker, released December 19, 2019. With 2 films already spent, one establishing Finn's potential, one pointedly ignoring it, The third film was Finn's last opportunity for the arc Boyega had assumed from the first script. Boyega's own description of what the finished film delivered? Relegated to delivering funny quips with only a hint of a storyline that never coalesces and is mostly tied to Rey anyway. The Force sensitivity resurfaced on screen once, in the quicksand pit on Pisana. Finn sinks. He screams Rey's name. The scene implies a Force connection. He climbs out. And then, the trilogy's chosen mechanism for addressing this was the running interruption gag. 4 separate moments where Finn attempts to tell Rey what he felt. 4 separate moments where an external event cuts him off before he can finish the sentence. The film treats the revelation as a comedic through line rather than a dramatic one, which means the scene where a former stormtrooper feels the Force for the first time across 3 films, the payoff of a 3-film setup, exists as the setup to a running joke. Abrams confirmed the intent post-release. Finn was trying to tell Rey he was Force-sensitive. The production had considered making it a love confession before landing on the Force sensitivity reveal as the stronger creative choice. The decision was deliberate. They knew what they had, they chose it, and then it was left on the cutting room floor. The deleted footage Boyega disclosed in 2024 placed the "I'm a Jedi" lines specifically in the context of the quicksand sequence, the same scene where the Force sensitivity was visible on screen. The cameras rolled. The performance was in the can. Someone in post-production decided not to use it. Boyega wasn't quiet about what the trilogy had delivered. A 2019 Hollywood Reporter interview had him already stating they could have done better with it, especially with Finn. The GQ UK interview, published in 2020, removed the diplomatic framing entirely. When asked whether making Star Wars had been a great experience, he answered, Nah. I'll take that deal when it's a great experience." On the marketing of his character against the reality of his role. What I would say to Disney is don't bring out a black character, market them to be much more important in the franchise than they are, and then have them pushed to the side. It's not good. I'll say it straight up. On where the creative weight actually went. They gave all the nuance to Adam Driver, all the nuance to Daisy Ridley. Let's be honest, Daisy knows this. Adam knows this. Everybody knows. I'm not exposing anything. He addressed Disney, not a specific director, the studio. When an actor identifies the institution rather than a creative collaborator as the source of his frustration, he is describing a structural failure, not a directorial disagreement. You can be disappointed with what a director chose for your character. What Boyega described was a promise made at the marketing level that the franchise itself never kept. After the GQ interview published, IGN reported that Boyega had honest conversations with Disney about his criticisms. Those conversations were confirmed. The arc wasn't retroactively restored. Here is the documented record of whether anyone above the directors was holding the plan. J.J. Abrams said, in an interview reported by Esquire, "Having a plan, I have learned, in some cases, is very important." Esquire's headline for that piece was, "Abrams admits the obvious. Disney didn't have a real plan when they made the new Star Wars trilogy." Multiple contemporaneous accounts document that Abrams and Johnson weren't working from a shared story document during TLJ's production. That they were, in one period summary, simply not making the same story. Kathleen Kennedy, appointed president of Lucasfilm at the time of the October 30th, 2012 Disney acquisition announcement, made a statement that received far less sustained analysis than it warranted. When discussing the challenge of producing new Star Wars films, she said, "There's no source material. The expanded universe, 30-plus years of post-Return of the Jedi novels, comic series, and games that had collectively built out Luke Skywalker's rebuilt Jedi Order, the Imperial remnant under Grand Admiral Thrawn, Han and Leia's marriage, and their son's early life, was exactly the kind of foundational material a story group exists to synthesize. It wasn't flawless. Much of it would have required significant modification for film, but it contained decades of tested narrative architecture for the characters and the world that 3 separate directors were about to be asked to build a coherent trilogy within." In April 2014, under Kennedy's oversight, Lucasfilm formally declared the entire expanded universe non-canonical. It was rebranded Legends and shelved. New stories would be built from scratch. The office that had inherited the franchise decided to begin with a clean slate at the exact moment the clean slate required someone to build a new foundation before cameras rolled. Kennedy's statement that there was no source material was technically accurate by April 2014 because her office had made it so. This placed the entire creative burden on the Lucasfilm Story Group, the continuity apparatus that included figures like Pablo Hidalgo operating under Kennedy's oversight, and on whatever planning framework Kennedy's office established before production began on The Force Awakens. The Story Group's stated mandate covered continuity across all Star Wars media. What it didn't produce, for the 3 films at the center of the franchise, was a binding story architecture that told each incoming director, "Here is who Finn is at the end of Film 3. Here is the arc you are required to protect across the handoff." The production instability across the sequel era extends beyond the trilogy itself and describes a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Lord and Miller, hired to direct Solo, a Star Wars story, were removed mid-production and replaced by Ron Howard. Colin Trevorrow, hired to direct Episode 9, was fired in September 2017, 26 months before the film's December 2019 release, with documented reports citing concerns over the script. His version, titled Duel of the Fates, was discarded entirely. J.J. Abrams came back as replacement director, inheriting a trilogy conclusion built on a dead main villain with no established successor, a contradicted answer to the central mystery of Rey's parentage, and a co-lead whose Force arc had been deferred across 2 consecutive films. Abrams' solution to the dead villain problem was to return Palpatine, killed definitively in 1983's Return of the Jedi, via opening crawl. Somehow, Palpatine returned. Ian McDiarmid, who played Palpatine across 6 films, disclosed that a scene had been filmed for Rise of Skywalker in which Kylo Ren explicitly identifies Palpatine as a clone, an explanation that would have immediately answered the audience's most urgent question about how the Emperor survived his death. That line was cut before release. The Palpatine clone explanation was filmed and removed. Finn's "I'm a Jedi" lines were filmed and removed. The Force sensitivity confirmation was delivered in a press interview rather than on screen. The pattern across the trilogy is consistent. Intentions existed. Footage was shot. Post-production decisions buried what was there, and answers arrived in press circuits instead of in the films they belonged in. Rian Johnson made specific, deliberate choices in The Last Jedi that caused real structural damage to the trilogy's continuity, and naming those choices directly is necessary. Positioning Johnson as a symptom of institutional failure rather than its root cause isn't a defense of those choices. Snoke, Supreme Leader of the First Order, introduced in TFA as the apparent master villain of a planned trilogy. Given a throne room, a gold robe, a retinue of Praetorian guards, and enough mystique to sustain a full film's worth of backstory revelation. Johnson killed him in TLJ's second act, in the single most kinetically inventive scene in the entire sequel trilogy. Cinematically, the death worked. It reoriented the central dynamic toward Kylo Ren and Rey with genuine surprise. The structural damage is what remains, killing the main villain in the 5th act of a 9-act structure, with no backstory revealed and no succession established. Snoke's origin, his motivations, his relationship to the Emperor's legacy, none of it was addressed before or after his death, because the kill happened before anyone had established what he was. Forbes noted at the time that Snoke's death created a big void at the trilogy's center. Abrams filled that void with "Somehow Palpatine returned." 4 words in an opening crawl where a thought-through answer was supposed to be. Rey's parents. TFA constructed the mystery with deliberate specificity. Young Rey, abandoned on Jakku, waiting for parents who never came back. Johnson resolved it as a deliberate subversion. Her parents were nobody, junk traders who sold her for drinking money. The choice served Johnson's thematic interest in the idea that heroism doesn't require lineage, that the Force chooses without regard for bloodline. As a standalone argument, it has genuine merit. As a sequel trilogy choice, made without knowledge of what the third film required, it was directly reversed in TROS. Rey is Palpatine's granddaughter. 2 consecutive films gave 2 contradictory answers to the same foundational question, because the answer had never been determined before production began on either film. The Knights of Ren, glimpsed in a TFA flashback as Kylo Ren's personal elite force, disappeared from TLJ entirely and resurfaced in TROS with no narrative function, killed quickly in a scene that required nothing from the audience and advanced nothing in the plot. Johnson had written his film without preserving space for them, and no institutional constraint required him to. They reappeared in the third film, not because Abrams had built a plan for them, but because they existed in TFA and needed acknowledgement before the credits rolled. Luke's arc in TLJ was Johnson's most contested and consequential choice. Luke Skywalker, who had refused to give up on Darth Vader, who had stared down the Emperor on the altar of his own certain death, who had been the template for moral courage in American popular mythology for 38 years, had, in the gap between Return of the Jedi and The Last Jedi, attempted to preemptively murder his own nephew in his sleep, failed, fled to a remote island, and was refusing to act while the galaxy burned. Mark Hamill told Johnson directly, before production began, what he made of this. His documented words: "I told him I fundamentally disagree with virtually everything you've decided about my character." He coined a name for the version in Johnson's script. Maybe he's Jake Skywalker. He's not my Luke Skywalker. Hamill committed to the performance, saw the finished film, and said publicly that, having seen the movie, I was wrong. His final position was acceptance. But that first instinct, the immediate response of an actor who had inhabited a character for 40 years upon reading a script for that character's return, documents what happens when a character passes from one hand to the next, without sufficient institutional specification of who they are and who they can't become. The instinct is evidence, regardless of how Hamill ultimately resolved it for himself. Johnson's own account of his departure from the franchise is revealing in its honesty. He described leaving the trilogy with no direction for whoever followed him, his characterization of how he passed the baton. A director working in a creative vacuum acknowledged it. The conditions that created the vacuum weren't his responsibility to establish or prevent. Captain Phasma appeared in The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. Total screen time across both films, 3 minutes and 30 seconds. 1 minute, 45 seconds per film. Gwendolyn Christie, cast in the role after 7 seasons of Game of Thrones, where she'd played a warrior of genuine physical and dramatic presence, was placed in pre-release marketing alongside the trilogy's central heroes and villains as a character of visual and narrative significance. The chrome armor, the commanding silhouette, the name. Everything about the character's design signaled that someone had built plans around her. In The Last Jedi, she was killed in a garbage compactor confrontation with Finn, exiting the trilogy before its final chapter. Christie's available documented quote on the experience survives only as far as, "It just seems." The full sentence doesn't appear in the record. The truncation is inadvertently appropriate. A great design, a committed actress, a role that nobody above the current film's director had committed to building an arc for. Because nobody owned her future past the film currently being made. Rey's arc makes the same point from a different angle. The Force Awakens established her with a staff. Her weapon, her identity, years of survival on Jakku condensed into a piece of salvaged equipment she'd repurposed and mastered. By the Rise of Skywalker, she was fighting with a lightsaber, and the trilogy's final scene showed her building her own. The transition reads on paper as a coherent Jedi identity arc, from defensive survival to deliberate mastery, from scavenging to creating. Planned from the beginning, it would be an elegant visual metaphor for a completed journey. The problem is the power escalation between staff and lightsaber was never plotted against a learning curve the audience could track. Defeating a trained Force user in her first lightsaber combat in TFA with no prior instruction was the first signal that something wasn't calibrated. Executing a Jedi mind trick on the first attempt. Force healing, arriving in Tross at full power with no established precedent. Each new ability materialized without the in-universe scaffolding a planned arc would have built beneath it. The lightsaber in the final scene only functions as a symbol of completed Jedi mastery if someone had been constructing that mastery before the first frame was shot. The available evidence points toward it as a late creative decision to give the trilogy's lead a coherent visual ending. Not the payoff of a planned arc, but an attempt to retroactively construct the impression of one. Which is precisely what Finn's Force sensitivity looked like from the outside. An intention confirmed in a press interview because the on-screen delivery had been removed from the finished film. George Lucas began writing The Phantom Menace in the mid-1990s. He already knew where Anakin Skywalker's story ended. That fact, the starting point written from the ending backward, is the entire explanation for why the prequel trilogy works as a character arc in a way the sequel trilogy doesn't. Episode 1 introduces Anakin at approximately 9 years old, a slave on Tatooine, working in a junk shop under the ownership of Watto. He builds things, droids, a pod racer, a protocol droid from salvaged parts, because building is how his mind works, because it's the one form of agency available to someone who owns nothing, including his own freedom. Qui-Gon Jinn identifies him as the Chosen One, the being of prophecy who will bring balance to the Force, because his midi-chlorian count exceeds even Master Yoda's. This is the architecture laid in the first act of the first film. Everything else in 3 films is the story of what happens to a being designated as the galaxy's salvation. Episode 2 advances the specific vulnerabilities that will eventually destroy him. Anakin has nightmares of his mother's suffering on Tatooine. He defies council orders and goes to her. He arrives too late. She dies in his arms. And in the grief and rage of that moment, he massacres the Tusken Raiders who took her. Not the combatants, everyone. He returns to Padme, having committed an atrocity, and tells her exactly what he did, because he can't contain what he felt. The seeds of his fall were always about this specific thing. A man whose emotional attachments are total, who can't accept loss, who will commit any transgression to prevent the people he loves from suffering. His forbidden marriage to Padme at the end of Episode 2 isn't a romance beat in isolation. It's a structural pivot that places the exact lever Palpatine will need in the exact position for Episode 3 to use. Episode 3. Anakin begins having nightmares of Padme's death in childbirth. Palpatine reveals himself as a Sith and offers the one thing the Jedi Council can't provide: the power to prevent the death he's seen. The moment Anakin stops Mace Windu from executing Palpatine, screaming, "I need him," is the moment 3 films of accumulated dramatic architecture pays off in a single action. One decision, built over 6 hours of film, designed from the beginning to be inevitable and to feel like it. After the moment passes, after Windu falls, after Anakin has done the irreversible thing, Lucas gives him a scene alone in the Jedi Council chamber, watching the sunset over Coruscant. The horror of what he's done is visible. He made the choice freely. It was still a trap. Both things are completely true simultaneously, and they're both completely true because one person had designed 3 films to make them so. That level of structural coherence, where a scene in Film 1 deposits a specific emotional charge that Film 3's climax draws on years later, doesn't happen by accident and doesn't happen by committee. It requires someone who already knows the ending before the first frame is shot, who designs every earlier scene in deliberate relationship to that ending, and who holds the institutional authority to protect that design across years of production. The prequel trilogy, whatever its legitimate criticisms of dialogue and pacing, tells one complete story, start to finish. The ending illuminates the beginning in a way that makes the beginning better when you return to it knowing what you know. The sequel trilogy had that position filled. Kennedy held the office. The story group held the continuity mandate. Every institutional structure that should have produced the same coherence was in place. What was absent was the function. One person, with the specific knowledge of where the story ends and the authority to hold every incoming collaborator accountable to it. Nobody performed that function for Finn across 3 films. The Anakin comparison doesn't flatter the sequel era. It indicts the structure that produced it. Finn's arc had identical foundational potential. A child taken by an authoritarian system. An identity stripped and replaced with a number. A single moment where the conditioning breaks and the human underneath it makes a choice against every instinct the institution had built into him. That moment on Jakku, the blaster at his side, the visor smeared with someone else's blood, was structurally equivalent to Anakin's slave quarters scene on Tatooine. Everything that followed was supposed to be built from it, the way 3 films were built from a 9-year-old boy being told he was the chosen one. The only requirement was an author who knew the ending before the cameras rolled. Kathleen Kennedy was appointed president of Lucasfilm at the time of Disney's October 30th, 2012 acquisition announcement. George Lucas had prepared sequel trilogy treatments, story outlines for episodes 7 through 9 that he expected to inform the new films. Bob Iger, by one documented account, personally rejected those scripts. Lucas reportedly felt betrayed when he realized his outlines weren't being used. His private characterization of the sale, comparing it to giving his children to white slavers, a statement documented in a Springer academic publication, is the clearest available record of what losing authorial control over the franchise meant to the person who had built it. What was discarded with Lucas's treatments wasn't just plot content. The creative model was discarded. The idea that one person should know where the story ends before anyone else begins. The public record of blame attribution for the sequel trilogy's failures concentrates almost entirely on Abrams and Johnson. Kennedy's name appears rarely in that conversation, despite her position as the executive architect of the franchise's direction for its entire sequel era. The case against Kennedy rests on documented evidence rather than on accusation, and it's narrower than the conversation typically frames it. Her job, as the president of Lucasfilm, overseeing a planned trilogy, was to ensure a plan existed. A story document specifying Finn's arc across 3 films. Force sensitivity established in TFA, developed in TLJ, completed in TROS, protected across the handoff between directors, was never built. The evidence for that absence is testimonial from the directors themselves. Abrams admitted there was no plan. Johnson's own account describes working without a shared story architecture and departing without leaving one for his successor. A third director was fired over the script 26 months before the film was due. The trilogy's 3 films contradict each other on fundamental questions: who the villain is, what Rey's parentage means, whether the co-protagonist is force-sensitive, because no institutional document had settled those questions before any director began work. The production pattern beyond the main trilogy extends the record. Lord and Miller were removed from Solo mid-production. Trevorrow was fired from Episode 9. The range of the instability suggests something structural about how the franchise was being administered, not a string of isolated misfortunes involving individual projects. Kennedy said, "There's no source material." Her office disqualified the expanded universe in April 2014. Her office set aside Lucas's treatments. Her office hired 3 different directors for a planned trilogy and didn't mandate the story architecture that would have made their individual creative choices compatible with each other. Each director made the film they could see from where they were standing. Nobody was standing far enough back to see all 3. Finn never became a Jedi. Boyega saw what the arc could be in the first script he read. He assumed it, built his expectations of the trilogy around it, and proposed to himself an arc that the on-screen evidence of Film 1 made completely reasonable. Abrams had a plan for it, confirmed the force sensitivity post-release, made the deliberate creative choice to include it as the thing Finn couldn't say across 4 interrupted scenes. The footage is in a vault. I'm a Jedi. Performed, on film, removed from the final cut before the trilogy ended. The arc was real, the intention was documented, the evidence was shot. What it never became was a commitment that survived the handoff between directors, because no document existed that required it to survive. No single person held the through line across 3 films and 3 creative visions and said, "This character becomes a Jedi, and every director hired between here and there must build toward it." George Lucas sat down in the mid-1990s to write The Phantom Menace, already knowing that the slave boy on Tatooine would become Darth Vader. He worked backward from the ending and designed every scene in relationship to it. The result was a coherent arc across 3 films that still, whatever its legitimate criticisms, tells one story completely. The ending illuminates the beginning. That is what a plan looks like when the person holding it has both the vision and the institutional authority to protect it. Kennedy's office held that institutional authority for the sequel trilogy's duration. The story group, the $4 billion acquisition, the infrastructure of the largest entertainment company in the world, all of it in place. What was absent was the function, knowing the ending before the beginning, and designing backward from it with sufficient authority to hold every subsequent collaborator to the result. Finn, Phasma in 3 minutes and 30 seconds. Luke in a milk-drinking exile his own actor initially didn't recognize. Rey's power curve arriving without the scaffolding a planned arc would have built beneath it. Snoke dead in the 5th act with no successor established. Palpatine returning via 4 words in an opening crawl. A clone explaining line, filmed and cut. An "I'm a Jedi" line, filmed and cut. Force sensitivity confirmed in a press interview 3 years after the final credits. None of those outcomes are the work of incompetent people. Abrams made The Force Awakens into a $2 billion film. Johnson made The Last Jedi into a film that still generates passionate defense from serious critics. What those outcomes represent is what happens when capable directors are given a franchise without being given an author. Each one made the best film they could see from where they were standing. The blame attribution that has dominated the public conversation for 6 years is one floor too low. The directors were given vacuums. They filled them. Kennedy's office built the vacuums. The stormtrooper who stopped firing on Jakku in December 2015, who picked up the lightsaber in the snow, who screamed in a sandpit and felt something he'd never felt before, who performed the lines that didn't make the cut, deserved a plan. The audience who showed up for the story deserved someone whose job it was to protect it. That's who killed it. Subscribe for more of these.